The field trip to the Aerospace Museum was considered the most boring event of the month. The class was spread out across the hall filled with satellite models, and no one was listening to the tour guide. Dan was bringing up the rear. It was always like that. He was considered a non-entity, the quiet kid in the back row who hadn't spoken to anyone in 3 years. Up ahead, three girls were laughing. Mia from the medical club, Laura, who won chemistry competitions, Emma, the biology nerd. They turned toward the far display case with a meteorite fragment, and for some reason, Dan followed them. Later, he still couldn't explain why. The rock in the display case glowed. The light turned white, then crimson. The floor vanished. A scream caught in his throat. A blow. Dan opened his eyes and saw a foreign sky. It was the color of diluted blood. Two moons hung over jagged cliffs. The air smelled of rust and something sweet. His throat burned with his first breath. The girls were getting to their feet nearby. Emma screamed. Laura shook her phone, which had no signal. Mia turned pale and sank down onto the rocks. And then something happened that none of them had expected. The quiet boy from the back row was the first to stand up. He ripped off his shirt and tore it into 4 strips. He ordered everyone to breathe only through the fabric and only through their noses. He said that a sweet smell in a toxic atmosphere almost always meant aldehydes, and that taking a deep breath right now was more dangerous than any wound. The girls froze. Laura looked at him as if lips had grown on a rock and the rock had spoken. She asked him how he even knew such words. Dan didn't answer. He was already surveying the area. The wind was blowing from the east. That meant they needed to head west toward the cliffs, where the air would be less saturated with toxic dust from the lowlands. He helped Mia to her feet and led the group behind him. No one argued. Arguing was scarier than obeying. After 200 steps, Emma coughed up blood. Mia examined her throat and said that the mucous membrane was already inflamed, and that after a day without protection, the dust would burn their lungs. The skin on the exposed parts of their hands was starting to itch and turn red. The planet was killing them slowly and politely. Under a rocky overhang, Dan collapsed to his knees, and only then noticed a foreign weight on his wrist. A bracelet. Seamless dark metal with a single blue spark inside. It hadn't been in the museum. It had appeared along with this sky. Dan touched the spark with his finger, and the world trembled. A window of light as tall as a person unfolded before him. Outside the window was a home improvement store on the outskirts of his city, the very one where he worked part-time as a loader on the weekends. Dan could see the shelves, the yellow price tags, and the bored security guard at the far checkout lane. Numbers flashed in the corner of the window. 60, 59, 58. He understood everything in a single heartbeat. This was the door home. And it would close in a minute. The girls screamed for him to jump and call for help. Dan stepped through the window and found himself in the workwear section. He didn't run toward the people. He ran toward the shelf with respirators. Later, Laura admitted that in that split second, she thought he'd left them to die. Dan grabbed 4 full-face respirators and a box of replacement filters. On his way back, he snatched a pack of water bottles and a pair of safety goggles from the shelf. 30 seconds. The guard shouted something at his back. 20 seconds. Dan leaped through the melting window with his load in his hands and crashed onto the rocks of a foreign world. The light behind him flickered out. The blue spark in his bracelet went out and turned gray. He exhaled and said that the portal stays open for a minute and that the spark probably needs to recharge. Their ears looked at the mountain of gear, then at him. Mia was the first to put on her respirator. She began breathing evenly and deeply, and tears of relief streamed down her face. Laura twirled the filter in her hands and muttered that the label indicated it was designed for organic vapors and acidic gases, and that it was almost the perfect choice for this kind of air. She looked up at Dan and asked why he hadn't called for help when he was standing in the middle of Earth. Dan answered her question with a question of his own, using her own logic. He said that no one could have organized a rescue expedition to another planet in a minute. But 4 respirators in a minute could save 4 lives right now. Laura fell silent. For the first time in 3 years of school, she couldn't think of a rebuttal. Emma asked who he even was. Dan tightened the straps of his mask and looked up at the blood-red sky. He said he was the one who would get them out of there alive. The wind picked up. A wall of reddish dust was rising from the lowlands and heading straight for them. Sunset was approaching, and they had no shelter. And where far away, on the crest of the black cliffs, a slender figure stood, gazing motionlessly down at the 4 strangers and the faded door of light. But none of them had seen this yet. The 4 high school students had been transported from a field trip to a planet with toxic air. And Dan, to everyone's surprise, took command, and, with his knowledge of survival, shattering his reputation as a quiet type. A bracelet appeared on his wrist that opened a portal to Earth for exactly 60 seconds before needing to recharge. And the first items they retrieved were respirators with filters, water, and goggles. A dust storm is approaching the group, there's no shelter, and an unknown figure, of whom the heroes are unaware, is already watching them from the crest of the cliffs behind them. A wall of dust engulfed the valley in a matter of minutes. Dan herded everyone deep into the rock overhang and ordered them to zip up all their zippers and fasten their cuffs. The red suspension lashed at the rocks like sandpaper. The respirators kept their air clean, but the exposed skin on Emma's neck broke out in a fine rash within an hour. Mia examined the rash by the light of her phone and said it was a first-degree chemical burn and that the dust acted like a corrosive powder. She divided up the remaining water and rinsed everyone's faces and hands. The storm howled until dark. No one slept. In the morning, the world grew quieter, and a crimson sun rose over the ridge. The spark in the bracelet glowed blue again. That meant a day here lasted about as long as one on Earth, and the charge had built up overnight. Dan gathered everyone into a circle and sketched a plan in the sand with a piece of rock. Each portal takes 60 seconds. Every second is a burden. That meant every trip out had to be prepared in advance, down to the last detail. He asked the girls what would kill them first. Mia replied that it would be dehydration because there was only enough water for the 4 of them to last one day. Laura added that the temperature dropped at night, and without a sealed shelter, their filters and lungs wouldn't last long. Emma silently pointed to her neck. Dan nodded and made a list. Plastic sheeting, duct tape, canisters, reinforced hose, a garden sprayer, and a roll of insulation. Laura raised an eyebrow and asked why they'd need a sprayer in a world where the rain was most likely acidic. Dan replied that that was exactly why. Using the sprayer, filters, and hose, they could assemble a primitive air purification station for the vestibule. Laura opened her mouth and closed it. Then she slowly said that the plan actually worked and that she should have thought of it herself. At noon, Dan activated his bracelet, visualizing the hypermarket's warehouse. A portal opened right between the shelves in the home goods section. 60 seconds turned into a sprint. He tossed rolls of plastic wrap, canisters, and spools of tape into the portal, while Emma caught them on the other side. At the 45th second, yesterday's security guard appeared in the aisle and froze with his mouth agape. Dan tossed the last canister and stepped into the fading light. The security guard remained standing in the middle of Earth, his scream frozen in midair. Laura noted that people would soon start talking about the glowing holes in the store. Dan replied that this was a problem for the future. For now, they had 4 hours of daylight and an entire base to build out of trash. They worked until sunset. They covered the canopy with a triple layer of plastic sheeting. They sealed the seams and weighed them down with rocks. Using a hose and a sprayer, Laura set up a rinse station at the entrance and filled it with a weak soda solution from the trash. It created a vestibule where dust was washed off clothing before anyone went inside. Emma found tufts of local gray-purple moss in a crevice and wouldn't touch them without gloves. She said that the moss grows only on the leeward side of the rocks, which means it avoids dust, and that this is the first local organism with understandable logic. By nightfall, a battery-powered lantern was burning inside the shelter. The air was warm and almost clean. And then an argument broke out that Dan would remember for a long time. Laura declared that their makeshift ceiling was self-deception, and that by morning, the air inside would be just as toxic as the air outside. She requested a measurement. She made her own indicator out of a strip of damp baking soda, which turned pink from the acidic vapors. Outside, the strip turned pink in a minute. Inside the shelter, the strip remained white all night. In the morning, Laura stared at the white strip for a long time, then at Dan. She said she had been wrong, and that this was the second time in her life she'd said that out loud. Mia laughed quietly for the first time in 2 days. And then the laughter stopped. Emma, who had gone out to the vestibule to get water, called out to everyone in a strained voice. On a flat rock 3 steps from the entrance lay objects that hadn't been there yesterday. A smooth black stone with a spiral carving. A tuft of that same purple moss tied with a sinew. And a bone as long as a palm, with a hole drilled through it. The objects lay in an even triangle, its apex pointing toward their door. The wind doesn't arrange things into triangles. Dan crouched over the stone and felt a chill creeping between his shoulder blades. He said what everyone had already realized. They weren't alone on this planet, and those who left the gifts had seen where their home was. The group had weathered a dust storm and, using a second supply run, had built an airtight shelter with a decontamination chamber. Moreover, the skeptic Laura had publicly acknowledged that Dan was right after the test with the indicator strip. It was determined that the bracelet's charge replenishes over the course of approximately 1 local day, and the security guard had already noticed the portals leading to the hypermarket. At the entrance to the base, unknown individuals left a ritual triangle made of stone, moss, and bone, which signifies that intelligent beings are watching. They decided not to touch the triangle until a consensus was reached. Mia suggested removing the offering so as not to encourage outsiders. Emma objected, saying that in nature, a conspicuous offering almost always signifies an attempt at contact rather than a threat. Dan listened to both of them and looked at the apex of the triangle, which was pointing directly at their door. He said that in primitive cultures, a rejected gift is often considered an insult. He took a shiny steel nut from the pile of discarded items and placed it in the center of the triangle. A return gift, a gesture of equality. Emma nodded slowly and said that this was the right way to communicate. The next 10 days merged into one long construction project. The base grew in sections, as if in fast forward. There they were, the 4 of them, hauling sheets of polycarbonate from the portal, while Dan marked out the second outline of the walls around the canopy. Here's Laura working her magic on the barrel where soda solution and charcoal from the waste pile are turning acidic condensate water into drinking water. She drinks the first glass herself amid everyone's silent horror, and a day later, she demonstratively spreads her arms because she's alive and well. Here's Emma, wearing gloves, planting purple moss on the ventilation filter, and proving that live moss traps red dust better than any rag. Here's the gasoline generator humming, carried out in pieces over 2 minutes on 2 different days, and a real lamp lights up in the shelter for the first time. And all 4 of them just stand there staring at the yellow light as if it were a miracle. By the 12th day, the base had an airlock, a week's supply of water, and a medical corner where Mia had laid out the first aid kit she'd brought. Unexpectedly, Mia herself became the skeptic at this stage. From the very beginning, she had quietly repeated that all of this was agony, and that it was impossible to survive here, one could only delay the end. On the evening of the 12th day, she took off her respirator inside the base, took a deep breath, and began to cry. She said that for the first time since the relocation, she was breathing without fear, and that she had been wrong to write them all off on the first day. Dan replied that it was still too early to bury them, at least another 60 years. For the first time ever, all 4 of them laughed at the same time. The respite lasted exactly 1 evening. On the morning of the 13th day, Dan discovered that the nut was missing from the triangle. In its place lay a new gift, a palm-sized plate of forged metal. They knew how to forge metal here. That changed everything. The civilization beyond the cliffs wasn't a band of savages with bones. An image was engraved on the plate. 4 figures beneath an arch. Above the arch was a circle with radiating rays and a rectangle from which the rays emanated. Laura was the first to understand and translated it in a hoarse voice. The rectangle was their portal. The creatures had seen a window of light. Emma added that the drawing was executed in a ritualistic style because the rays were depicted just like those of the local sun. To observers, the gateway to Earth looked like a divine manifestation. Dan stood silently over the plate for a long time. Then he said they had 2 options. Hide and eventually be caught by the crowd right at the portal. Or manipulate this belief while it still worked in their favor. Mia said that playing God was dangerous. Dan replied that being mortals without allies on a toxic planet was even more dangerous. They decided to observe in response. Emma and Dan climbed to the ridge with binoculars from their latest supply run. Beyond the cliffs lay a valley that wasn't visible from the base. Neat rows of terraces stretched across the valley floor. Between the terraces stood domed structures made of stone and clay. Smoke curled above the domes. Dan counted at least 40 structures. At the far end of the valley, on a hill, stood a dome larger than the others, surrounded by a ring of vertical stones. Emma whispered that it looked like a temple. And then Dan saw the inhabitants. Tall, slender figures in cloaks made of something resembling woven moss. Gray skin, 4 fingers. Their faces were indistinguishable from that distance. One of them stood alone on a rock at the edge of the valley, looking straight at the ridge. Straight at them. Dan lowered his binoculars very slowly. The creature on the rock raised its hand and kept it raised as they retreated behind the ridge. It wasn't a threat. It was a greeting. That evening at the base, they argued until they were hoarse. And that night, Dan was awakened by a sound. A faint, rhythmic clang of metal against stone came from the direction of the entrance. Someone was standing at their door and knocking. Patiently, politely, like a guest who knows the hosts are home. In 10 days of construction, the team had built a base complete with an airlock, a water purification system, a generator, and moss filters. And even the group's skeptic Mia admitted that survival was a real possibility. The exchange of gifts with the locals reached a new level when the outsiders left a wrought iron plate bearing an image of a portal, proving the sophistication of their civilization and its perception of Earth technology as divine. A reconnaissance mission discovered a valley with terraces, domes, and a temple. And at night, one of the locals came right up to the base's door and began knocking. The knocking didn't stop. It was steady, like a metronome. Dan roused the others without causing panic, using only gestures. Laura grabbed the axe that had been brought out. Mia stood by the first aid kit. Emma pressed her face against the viewing slit in the plastic sheeting and froze. Then she stepped back and said there was one person out there, all alone and unarmed. Dan looked through the slit himself. Standing at the door was a local resident, a head taller than a human. Its slender body was wrapped in a woven cloak. The gray skin on its face was creased with fine folds. It had 2 large eyes that reflected the lamp's light like a cat's. In its 4-fingered hand, the creature held that very steel nut. It was tapping the nut against a stone. It had brought the gift back, not as a rejection. It held the nut carefully between 2 fingers, as if it were a sacred object, and clearly wanted to show them something. Dan made a decision that, once again, no one expected. He told Laura to lower the axe and began getting dressed to go out. Mia hissed that this was madness. Dan replied that the creature had come at night and alone precisely because its own kind would have spotted it during the day. It wasn't an envoy. It was a renegade, an outcast, or a very brave loner. And a loner is the most valuable source of knowledge about the crowd. He stepped out into the airlock empty-handed, carrying only a lantern. The creature didn't flinch. It placed a nut on a rock and covered it with its palm, then pointed at the sky and at the bracelet on Dan's wrist. Dan crouched down to make himself look smaller. The gesture worked. The creature's shoulders relaxed. The next hour was the strangest lesson of Dan's life. The creature drew in the dust with a stick. It drew a sun, an arc, and some figures. Then it drew a rectangle with rays and fell prostrate before the drawing. Then it stood up, wiped away the drawing with its palm, and looked Dan in the eyes. The meaning hit Dan like a blow. The creature first demonstrated the faith of its people, and then its rejection of it. It did not consider the portal to be a god. It wanted to know what it really was. Standing before it was a local heretic, a scientist without the right to be a scientist. Dan pointed his finger at the bracelet, then at the drawn sun, and shook his head. Then he drew a gear in the dust and pointed to the nut. Not a god. A tool. The creature emitted a long, vibrating sound and sat down in the dust across from him. And so they sat there, a human and an outsider. Two craftsmen among the faithful. By dawn, the creature had left, taking the nut with it and leaving behind a rolled-up sheet of strange leather. On the sheet was a map of the valley, drawn with dots and lines. Near the large dome with a ring of stones stood a symbol, a rectangle with rays, the same symbol as the portal. Inside the temple was something resembling the door to their home. In the morning, Dan laid out the map in front of the girls, and for 3 hours the base buzzed like a beehive. Emma named the night visitor Irhi because the creature had repeated that sound 3 times, pointing to itself. Laura demanded that an expedition to the temple be prepared immediately. Mia insisted they shouldn't meddle in the sanctuary of an alien civilization, even in search of hope. And then Mia started coughing. The cough was long and wet, and she turned away, but everyone had already seen the pink foam on her lips. She diagnosed herself in the steady voice of a doctor. Those first days without protection had taken their toll. Toxic pulmonary edema developed slowly, and her lungs had received the highest dose because she had been lying unconscious the longest, right on the ground where the dust was thickest. Filters slow down the process but don't cure it. She needs corticosteroids and oxygen, and she needs them within the next few days. The silence at the base grew as thick as concrete. Dan stared at his bracelet, where the spark was just beginning to turn blue after yesterday's haul of building materials. There was half a day left until recharge. 60 seconds to get prescription drugs that aren't on the shelves of a supermarket.
The pharmacy warehouse is locked and secured by an alarm system. The hospital is under surveillance and guarded. Laura began listing options and stopped short. Dan was already writing a list on a scrap of cardboard. He asked Mia for the exact names of the medications, their dosages, and where they were kept in the hospital. Mia replied that she'd done her internship at the city clinic and knew the emergency supply cabinet in the emergency room. It stood 5 steps away from where she could mentally picture herself standing. Dan nodded and said aloud something that made everyone's hands go cold. He wouldn't be the one to open the portal today. The bracelet was coming off his wrist. He checked it again on the 3rd day and said nothing. In 60 seconds, Mia would be on Earth today because only she could find the right cabinet and the right vials in a minute. But what if her lungs failed right there in the middle of the reception area? No one voiced that question aloud, but it hung over the base until evening. And outside, from the crest of the cliffs, 3 slender figures were already watching their dome. And one of them was wearing a tall headdress made of bone.
The nighttime visitor turned out to be a local heretic named Irhui, who does not believe in the divinity of the portal, and handed over a map of the valley showing a temple where an object marked with the same symbol as the portal is located. Mia has been diagnosed with toxic pulmonary edema and urgently needs prescription medications and oxygen, neither of which are available at the store. Dan discovered that the bracelet can be removed and decided to send Mia herself through the 1-minute portal to the emergency room of a clinic he knows, while 3 locals, including a figure in a bone headdress resembling a priest, are already watching the base. They mapped out the preparations down to the second, just like an assault. Mia walked the route 3 times with her eyes closed, following the plan drawn on the floor of the base. 3 steps from the starting point to the guard post. Turn. 5 steps to the emergency supply cabinet. The top shelf holds ampules. The middle shelf holds the nebulizer and masks. Laura had sewn inner pockets for the ampules onto her jacket so her hands would remain free. Emma stood by the exit with a watch, tasked with shouting the countdown every 10 seconds. Dan took off his bracelet, and for the first time in 2 weeks, the metal left his wrist. The skin beneath it was pale, with a faint bluish pattern that mirrored the bracelet's design. The pattern wouldn't wash off. No one said a word about it out loud because there was no time for fear. Mia put on the bracelet, closed her eyes, and pictured the emergency room. A spark flared. A window of light opened, and the scent of an earthly hospital wafted out of it. Antiseptic, coffee, and a wet floor. Mia stepped inside. The countdown began. Dan looked through the portal window and saw her run past a stunned nurse. 10 seconds. The cabinet opened with her intern code on the first try. 20 seconds. Ampules poured into her sewn-in pockets. 30 seconds. Mia yanked a suitcase-sized oxygen concentrator off its bracket and dragged it toward the portal. 40 seconds. A hospital security guard stepped in her path. And then Mia did what people would later retell to one another as a legend. She didn't run away. She shouted code blue to the guard and waved her hand down the hallway. The guard turned in the direction indicated by the hand in the medical jacket because obedience to an alarm code was ingrained in him more deeply than curiosity. 50 seconds. Mia tumbled into the window of light along with the concentrator and crashed onto the rocks of an alien planet. And the portal snapped shut behind her, shearing off the government-issued hospital shoe cover that had caught on the edge. She lay on her back, gasping for breath and laughing at the same time. That evening, she gave herself her first injection and fell asleep with an oxygen mask over her face, lulled by the hum of the concentrator. Laura sat beside her all night. By morning, Mia's breathing had evened out for the first time in a week. Her health problem had receded. And exactly 1 breather scene later, as if by the laws of this world, a bigger problem arrived. There was knocking at the base's door again. But now, the knocking was different. Heavy. Solemn. Dan peered through the crack and saw a procession. 12 Irchi stood in a semicircle around the base. At the front stood a figure in a bone headdress and a robe of bleached moss. The priest held a stretcher made of poles in his 4-fingered hands. An Irchi child lay on the stretcher. The small gray body was shaking violently. The skin on its chest was swollen with black blisters. Emma gasped. It looked like the same dust-induced illness, only in a monstrous form. The priest set the stretcher down on the stone. Then he removed his headdress and laid it nearby. Then he lay face down in the dust and remained motionless. And the entire semicircle behind him lay down in turn. The meaning was clear without any words. The gods who open the glowing doors can do anything. Save the child. Dan stood by the door and felt the trap of their own success snapping shut. If they saved the child, they would become gods once and for all, with all the obligations that came with it. If they failed, their faith would be replaced by, and a faith that's been rejected always has sharp edges. Mia, still weak after the night, was already getting up from the cot and clipping the first aid kit to her belt. She said she'd taken the oath not just for Earth. Laura was mixing a baking soda solution to rinse the burns. Emma was flipping through her notes on local biology and muttering that if their biochemistry is even slightly similar to Earth's, then the steroids might work or they might kill, and that the dose needs to be divided by 10. Dan opened the airlock and stepped out to meet the procession first. He lifted the priest out of the dust by the shoulders, because he didn't want to talk to people lying down. The priest's eyes were old and intelligent, and there was no blind adoration in them. There was calculation. This Irhi was testing them. The treatment lasted until sunset. Mia and Emma worked on the child in the antechamber, while Dan kept an eye on the priest who was watching them, flushing, a microdose of the medication, an oxygen mask over the small gray face. Twice the child stopped breathing, and twice Mia brought him back. When darkness fell, the trembling ceased, the black blisters lightened at the edges, and the child opened his eyes for the first time and let out a faint sound, like a bird's. The semicircle of Irchi responded with a collective low hum that made the stones vibrate. The priest approached Dan and did something even he hadn't expected. The priest did not bow. The priest touched his wrist to Dan's wrist, right where the pattern from the bracelet was turning blue. And he pulled back the sleeve of his robe. On the priest's gray skin was the same pattern. Old, faded, scarred into the flesh. The priest pointed to the pattern, then to the distant dome of the temple in the valley, then to the sky. And he uttered a long phrase, in which Dan could make out only one word, repeated 3 times, the name the Irhi used for their temple. The meaning of the gesture was more terrifying than any threat. The bracelet had once been on this planet, and someone from the Irhi had worn it, which meant that behind the ring of stones in the temple lay not just a similar object. There lay the answer to the question of who had brought the 4 school children here and why. The priest waited. The invitation had been extended. The path to the temple was open, and there was no turning back now. Mia, wearing the bracelet, made a quick dash to the hospital's emergency room, retrieved some medication and an oxygen concentrator, and stopped her pulmonary edema, and Dan was left with an indelible blue pattern on his skin beneath the bracelet. The Irhi procession, led by the priest, brought the dying child, and his salvation through microdoses cemented the group's status as gods. The priest pointed to the same ancient pattern on his wrist left by the bracelet and invited the heroes into the temple, where the artifact associated with the bracelet was kept, along with the answer regarding the reason for the transfer. The trip to the temple was scheduled for 2 days later, so that Mia could regain her strength. During those 2 days, Dan prepared the group as if for a military operation. He assigned who would carry what, who would bring up the rear, and what signals would indicate a retreat. They used the bracelet's fresh charge to gather supplies according to his separate list: powerful flashlights, ropes, and a crowbar. A gas analyzer with acid test tubes that Laura had found in a hardware store catalog, which Dan said was the best item they'd ever brought along. Uri, his name was Ure, arrived the night before the expedition. Dan could already tell him apart from the others by the chip on his left brow ridge. The nighttime visitor drew in the dust for a long time, and in great detail. A diagram of the temple's interior, a circular hall, a descent, another descent, and at the very bottom, a rectangle with rays, crossed out by 2 diagonal lines. Emma stared at the crossed-out symbol for a long time and said that in any symbolic system, it meant the same thing. Forbidden, or broken, or dead. Irhi pointed his finger at the crossed-out symbol, then at Dan's bracelet, and then made a gesture with both hands as if snapping a branch. Laura sighed, saying that the second door deep inside was most likely destroyed. In the morning, the 5 of them set out. The priest was waiting at the start of the trail with 2 tall Irhi in cloaks adorned with bone plates. Guards. Or an escort. The journey through the valley was a shock in itself. Near the terrace were fields where cultivated moss in a dozen shades grew in rows. The Irhi emerged from the domes and lay down in the dust along the trail. Hundreds of gray bodies. Mia walked, as white as her mask, and whispered that she felt like an imposter. Dan whispered an order for everyone to walk steadily, not to wave their arms, and not to smile beneath their masks. because the gods do not fidget. The temple up close was overwhelming, a ring of vertical stones 3 human heights tall. Each stone was covered in carvings, and a single motif repeated itself in the carvings. A rectangle with rays of light, figures entering the rectangle, figures emerging from the rectangle with objects in their hands. Laura stopped by a stone, ran her finger along a groove, and said aloud what Dan had already figured out for himself. This isn't mythology, it's a chronicle. Someone has already walked through the glowing door from here to retrieve the offerings. Inside the dome, the air smelled of smoke and moss. The priest lit the oil lamps. The light revealed from the darkness the very thing they had been led here to see. In the center of the hall, on a stone pedestal, lay a hand. Irhi's mummified 4-fingered hand, severed above the wrist. And on its wrist sat a bracelet, just like Dan's, only dead. The metal was dull and covered in scale, and the spark socket had burned out completely. Emma quietly asked why the hand had been severed. The priest seemed to understand the question. He began to speak in a chanting tone, acting out scenes with gestures and pointing to the carvings on the walls in a circle. The story came together like a mosaic. The wearer of the bracelet had lived long ago. He would open the door and bring offerings, and the people called him the one who speaks with the heavens. Then he began to bring more than just gifts. The carvings showed figures lying prostrate and a figure holding a whip. The wearer became a god, and the god became cruel. And so the priest of that time severed the hand with the bracelet while the wearer slept. The door died along with the hand, and the people swore to wait for a new wearer and to test his heart before letting him into the temple. Dan stood before the mummy and felt the gazes of all the Irhi in the hall on his back. The test with the child. The test with the gifts. They had been tested from the very first day. The priest approached and pointed to the lower tunnel leading from the hall into the darkness. Then at Dan's bracelet, then downward. The most important thing lay deeper. The descent took an hour. The steps had been carved into the rock long before the current generations and were worn smooth to a shine. Laura's gas analyzer showed that the air below was cleaner than on the surface. Someone had known how to ventilate this place a very long time ago. The final flight of stairs led into a hall that took everyone's breath away, even through their filters. The walls of the hall weren't made of stone. A smooth, dark, seamless material rose upward in a perfect arc. It was the same material as the bracelet. The entire hall was a single object, a single machine the size of a house. In the center of the hall stood an arch twice as tall as a person. A rectangle, the very same rectangle from the engravings and the plaque. A real large door, next to which the bracelet's tiny window served as a keyhole. But a crack cut through the arch, a diagonal fissure a finger's width wide, running the entire length of the arch. The crossed-out symbol was not a prohibition. It was a precise diagram of the damage. Dan approached the arch, and the blue pattern on his wrist flared up and throbbed as if burned. The bracelet came to life on its own. The spark flickered rapidly and alarmingly. And then, in the deathly silence of the hall, a sound rang out that hadn't been heard here for centuries. A quiet, steady voice from within the walls. The voice spoke in a language none of the humans knew. But after the third phrase, it fell silent. It clicked. And it announced in clear Russian that the key bearer had been detected, that the evacuation protocol had been compromised, and that there were 190 days remaining until the stabilizing circuit's disintegration was complete. Inside the temple, the group saw the mummified hand of the previous bracelet bearer, whom the Irhi had killed for cruelty. After that, they had spent centuries testing new bearers for kindness, which explains all the trials involving the gifts and the child. Hidden beneath the temple was a gigantic mechanism made of the same material as the bracelet, featuring a large portal arch split by a crack. The machine recognized Dan as the key bearer, spoke in Russian, and announced that the evacuation protocol was damaged and that there were 190 days remaining until the stabilizing circuit failed. The voice from the walls no longer answered any questions. It repeated the message 3 times with equal pauses and fell silent. No matter how many times Dan pressed the bracelet against the arch or spoke into the darkness, the hall remained silent as a stone. Laura was the first to stop shouting at the walls and start thinking. She said that the phrase was structured like a service announcement, not a conversation. That meant they were dealing with a machine with remnants of a program, not a conversational partner. And the machine had given a number, 190 days, a countdown to something called the collapse of the stabilizing circuit. Emma asked aloud what everyone was thinking. What exactly would happen when the circuit collapsed? No one answered. Upstairs, the priest met them at the tunnel exit and could tell from their expressions that the outsiders had heard the voice of the depths. He wasn't surprised. He made a gesture that Dan had already learned, his palm moving forward and upward from his chest. That was how the Irhi signified the distant past. Then the priest pointed to the ceiling of the hall, mimicked a full-body tremor, and traced a wave with his hand. The earth had shaken. Long ago, when the voice of the depths had sounded for the last time. They walked back in silence. Back at the base, Dan laid out everything they knew on the table and spoke in a tone the girls had never heard from him before. He said that now they had 2 tasks instead of 1. The first was the same as before, to survive and find a way home. The second was new. Within 190 days, they had to figure out what would break beneath the temple, because the machine occupying the mountain, the one capable of keeping the doors between the worlds open, would hardly just shut down if it malfunctioned. Laura added that the word stabilizing was the one she liked the least. Stabilizers are installed where, without them, things would fall apart. The weeks began that Dan would later call to himself the era of 2 fronts. The days passed in a series of montages. Here, by lamplight, Laura is redrawing the crack in the arch from photographs and constructing a table of 30 future timelines, where every minute of the portal's operation is mapped out with epoxy resins, a scanner, and tools. Here, Emma is sitting on a rock across from Irhi, and they take turns naming objects, each in their language, and her vocabulary grows to 300 words. The first abstract word they manage to translate is promise. Here's Mia setting up a full-fledged infirmary in the vestibule and treating Irhi's 5th child for dust sickness, while the gray mothers begin leaving fresh shoots of edible moss at the base's door. Just like that, without any... Dan, in 60-second raids, brings out a generator-powered welder in pieces, an industrial crack scanner, and a materials science textbook that Laura reads at night. And then day 41 arrived, and something happened that shattered their previous calculations. The portal opened to the wrong place. Dan visualized a hypermarket warehouse as usual. The portal opened in a back room, but behind the shelves stood people in dark uniforms without insignia, watching the aisle through cameras mounted on tripods. Earth had been warned. Someone had cross-referenced the security guard's reports with the surveillance footage and the recurring thefts, and now they were guarding the exit point. Dan didn't step inside. He stood there for a full minute on his side, watching as a man in uniform slowly turned toward the window of light and raised his hand to his radio. The portal closed. Dan sat down on the rocks and, for the first time in weeks, cursed out loud. Laura had articulated the problem with cold precision. The exit point was tied to a place Dan knew well. He didn't have many such places. Home, school, the hypermarket, the clinic, after Mia's raid, was also compromised. Every subsequent extraction was now a game with people waiting. And without extractions, repairs to the arch and the infirmary would grind to a halt, and that would be it. Emma asked if it was possible to open a portal to places known not to Dan, but to whoever wore the bracelet. Everyone looked at her. Then at the bracelet. They'd already tested the rule on Mia. The wearer sets the location. That meant they had 4 sets of earthly locations, not just one. Dan smiled slowly for the first time that day. He said that Laura would wear the bracelet tomorrow because her father worked as a stock clerk at a wholesale building materials warehouse on the other side of town, and she'd spent half her childhood there. The laughter didn't last long. That night, the warehouse shook. A low rumble rippled up from beneath the ground, causing the dishes to clatter and dust to fall from the ceiling. The tremor lasted 4 seconds. From the direction of the valley came the many-voiced howl of the urchi. And when Dan rushed outside, he saw a pillar of faint blue light above the temple, shooting from the top of the dome straight into the crimson sky. The light flickered and went out. The bracelet on his wrist burned his skin. 149 days, his memory said. The machine at the foot of the mountain began to fail faster than scheduled. The group divided their efforts into 2 fronts, repairing the arch within 190 days and ensuring their survival. Laura was planning transport runs for the repairs. Emma had compiled a dictionary of urchi, and Mia was healing their children, turning faith into a bond. Earth authorities had calculated and placed the exit point at the hypermarket under surveillance, but the group realized that each bracelet wearer sets their own exit points, and Laura would be next to head to her father's wholesale warehouse. That night, an underground tremor and a pillar of blue light above the temple indicated that the circuit's disintegration was accelerating, and there was less time than promised. In the morning, a priest arrived at the base without an entourage and without ceremony. He placed a fragment of carved bone in front of Dan and spoke slowly so that Emma could keep up with the translation using her dictionary. The translation came out choppy but terrifying. The earth had trembled before, long before the current elders were born. Back then, light had shone from the mountain for many days. Then the sky changed. Emma stumbled over the next word and asked her to repeat it twice. The priest repeated it and pointed to the respirator on her face. The word meant poison. The sky had become poison. Laura was the first to understand, and her voice caught in her throat. She said that the stabilizing field might not be holding the portal. Perhaps it was holding the atmosphere. The planet hadn't always been poisonous. It had become that way after the last breakdown. And if the circuit were to completely collapse, the air they breathed now would seem to them like a fresh mountain breeze. Dan asked the priest one question through Emma. How many urchi had lived in the valley before the sky turned to poison? The priest traced a wide circle with his hand, then another and another. Many circles, many valleys. The urchi had been a great people. Only one valley remained because only here does the mountain still breathe and hold the remnants of purity above the earth. Now repairing the arch was no longer just a way home. It had become the salvation of 2 species at once. The work proceeded with the fury of the doomed. Laura put on her bracelet and opened the door to her father's wholesale warehouse. She knew every passageway there. In 60 seconds, she rolled a cart loaded with bags of repair mixture out through the portal, and her father stepped out from behind a shelf and saw his daughter, who had disappeared 2 months earlier into a glowing hole in the air. Laura managed to shout to him that she was alive, that she loved him, and that she would return. The door closed. Laura sat by the wall of the base for an hour, and no one bothered her. Then she got up and went to work. A week later, it was Emma's turn. Her assigned location was her aunt's veterinary clinic, where she'd been volunteering since childhood. From there came a microscope, a centrifuge, and reagents for lab tests. Mia couldn't take any more from her own clinic. They were waiting there. However, her knowledge of hospital supply rooms helped Laura compile lists of substitutes using veterinary and construction equivalents. The crack scanner revealed what they had feared. The fracture extended a third of the way into the arch's material and grew with every tremor. Earth-made epoxy wouldn't bond to the black material at all. Welding didn't even leave a mark on it. Laura struggled with samples of fragments collected at the base of the arch, and after 12 days, she burned through her last electrode and admitted that Earth technology was powerless here. Urhi unexpectedly emerged as the skeptic of the group. The nocturnal visitor had watched their attempts for many evenings in a row And one day he brought a pot of gray paste and gestured to show that the arch wasn't repaired with fire. The paste was alive. Under Emma's microscope, it teemed with microorganisms that ate the stone crumbs and secreted a layered mineral. For centuries, the Irhi had used this culture to repair their carved stones. The colony healed the cracks just as a bone heals a fracture. Laura mixed the paste with crushed fragments of black material and applied a test patch to a small shard. 3 days later, the patch had fused so completely that a chisel wouldn't budge it. Laura looked at the result and said that this primitive culture had just solved a problem that had stumped all her knowledge from the chemistry Olympiad, and that she would never again utter the word primitive. The restoration of the arch began. The Urchi carried the paste from the valley in baskets. Emma and Mia cultivated the culture in the warmth of the base, accelerating its growth with terrestrial glucose, which made the microorganisms thrive and work 10 times faster. Laura and Dan filled the crack layer by layer, descending beneath the temple every day. The tremors recurred. Each tremor shook off a portion of the fresh growth, and each time they all over again. On the 120th day since the countdown began, the seam had closed 2/3 of the crack, and the voice of the walls suddenly came to life, announcing that the integrity of the circuit had been partially restored, that the rate of decay had been reduced, and that the estimated time had been extended by 90 days. In the hall beneath the temple, 4 people and a dozen Irhi shouted with joy in 2 languages. The respite lasted for 1 scene. That evening, Dan opened his portal to the only unlit spot he had left. His own apartment, where his mother lived. He just wanted to leave her a letter. He stepped into his room and froze. A man in plain clothes was sitting in the chair at his desk, and the man didn't seem surprised. The man had been waiting for him. He raised his empty palms and said calmly that his name was Kramer, that he represented a team that had been investigating the incidents for 2 months, and that Dan's mother was alive and well and under protection. And then Kramer said what he'd been sitting in that chair for weeks to say. He said they'd measured the portal's energy and calculated the planet's location, and that the Earth government was preparing its own expedition. And that Dan would be better off cooperating voluntarily, because the door to the other side would soon be opened without him. It turned out that the underground machine was preserving what remained of the habitable atmosphere, and the planet had been poisoned by a previous breakdown in the circuit, making the repair a lifesaver for both humans and the Urchi. Earth's technology proved powerless against the crack, but the Urchi's living mineral paste, accelerated by glucose, was healing the fault, and by the 120th day, 2/3 of the crack had closed, and the machine had extended the deadline by 90 days. Agent Kramer was waiting at Dan's mother's apartment. He reported that Earth had calculated the planet's coordinates and was preparing its own expedition with or without him. 60 seconds were ticking away, and Dan stood in the middle of his own room, staring at the man in the chair. Kramer didn't move or reach for a weapon, and that frightened him more than any capture. Dan managed to say only 3 things: that the air there was deadly without filters, that an intelligent people lived on the planet, and that if the Earth expedition arrived acting like masters, the history he'd seen carved into the stones would repeat itself. The portal snapped shut in the middle of Kramer's reply. Dan returned to base and told them everything. The council meeting lasted until dawn. Laura said that contact with Earth was inevitable, and that it was better to establish it themselves than to wait for a landing party. Mia said that governments don't know how to arrive quietly, and that the Irhi would become exhibits or test subjects. Emma remained silent longer than anyone else, and then said a phrase that settled everything. She said that they had something no government possessed. They have a year of trust, a vocabulary, and the status of those who speak with the heavens. If Earth is going to come anyway, then let it come through their door and on their terms. Dan made up his mind. They'll prepare the next communication session themselves, like negotiations, not as an escape. The preparations took 3 trips. On the first, Dan walked backward out of his room, carrying a bag of documents he'd gathered in advance. Photographs of the valley, voice recordings from the machine, a sample of the paste, a 10-page letter where everything was laid out dryly and point by point like a report. He left the bag on his desk for Kramer, along with the date and location of the next opening. On the second trip, via Laura's contact, they sent a second copy to her father, because Dan didn't trust single channels. The third time, the portal opened at the appointed hour in Dan's apartment, and Kramer was sitting in the same armchair. But now there was a table in front of the armchair, and on the table lay papers, a voice recorder, and a second cup of tea. The 60-second-per-day negotiations became the strangest diplomatic format in the history of the two planets. Dan spoke pre-rehearsed blocks of text. Kramer responded in writing because a letter could be read on the other side without haste. Over the course of 8 sessions, they negotiated the main points. Earth would not send a military expedition while repairs to the circuit were underway. Earth receives scientific data through the team. The 4 of them themselves are preparing the first official contact with the Irhi, and no landing will take place without the consent of the Priestly Council. In return, the team will accept 1 observer on their side. Kramer insisted on this point adamantly, and Dan relented because he understood a simple truth. An observer on their territory is a hostage to their truth. Let her watch. The observer turned out to be a woman named Sol, a doctor and xenobiologist from a classified program.
She passed through the portal with a single backpack and stepped onto the rocks of the alien planet. The first thing she did was drop to her knees and take a soil sample, and the second was to bow to the approaching priest according to all the rules she had gleaned from the dictionary Emma had provided. Mia whispered that perhaps they had been sent the right person.
Sol's skepticism was professional and relentless. She didn't trust the numbers regarding the countdown extension and spent a week double-checking everything with her own instruments. She went down beneath the temple, tapped along the seam, took culture scrapings, and hounded Laura with calculations as if she were defending a dissertation. On the 8th day, she gathered everyone together and said dryly that she was forced to admit 3 things. The repairs were real. Irhi's technology surpassed Earth's materials science solutions. And 4 high school students had done in a year what her agency would have assigned to an institute to complete in 5 years. She said she would write exactly that in the report. Laura later admitted that those words made her hands shake more than the first tremor had. The repairs were entering the home stretch. The seam had closed the crack by 9/10. The machine's voice began to speak more frequently and one day uttered a new phrase. It reported that once the circuit was restored, it would be possible to initiate the evacuation protocol in both directions, and that a key carrier inside the arch would be required to trigger it. Inside, not nearby. Laura and Sol exchanged glances, and neither of them voiced what they were thinking. And a day later, something happened that threw all the schedules into disarray. Dan woke up to Emma's scream. She was standing at the entrance, pointing toward the valley. Smoke was rising from the distant mountains beyond the valley. A lot of smoke, in a continuous chain. The priest ran over on his own without being called and spoke so quickly that Emma could barely keep up. Others were coming from that side of the mountains. Emma translated the word he kept repeating based on its roots, and her lips turned white. The word meant the exiled. The Irhi were not the only surviving people. Beyond the mountains, in the Deadlands, lived those whom the ancestors of the current valley had once banished to die. The descendants of the exiles. They had breathed poison for generations, and the poison had changed them. And now they had seen the pillars of blue light above the mountain and were heading toward the temple. Because their legends, too, remembered the door to the sky. Only their legends commanded them not to repair it. Their legends commanded them to take it away. Dan turned the threat of an earthly invasion into negotiations, and over the course of 7-minute sessions with Agent Kramer, he established the rules. No military expedition, only scientific exchange and contact with the Irhi through the group, with Dr. Sol serving as an observer, who, after inspections, acknowledged the reality of the repairs and the superiority of the Irhi culture. The machine reported that to activate the restored evacuation protocol, The key carrier must be inside the arch. A crowd of exiled Irhi, generations altered by poison, is approaching the temple from beyond the mountains. They do not wish to repair the door, but to seize it. A reconnaissance team was dispatched immediately. Dan, Emma, and 2 temple guards climbed to the far ridge and lay down among the rocks. Below, a column was marching across the dead plain. Emma counted aloud and lost count after 400. The exiles differed from the Valley Irhi as much as a wolf differs from a dog. They were shorter in stature and broader boned. Their skin was not gray but black-purple, with growths on their shoulders. They walked without masks or cloaks across terrain where a Valley Irhi would die within a day. The poison had become their heir. At the head of the column, sledders pulled bone cages, and inside the cages sat beasts that Emma could not identify as belonging to any species in her records. And above the column, a symbol swayed on a pole, a rectangle crossed by 2 diagonal lines, a broken door serving as a banner. Upon his return, Dan convened a war council consisting of the people, the priestly circle, and Soul. The situation was stark and terrifying. The valley could field about 200 Irhi capable of fighting, armed with spears and slings. The exiles outnumbered them 4 to 1, and they didn't need filters. A siege would destroy the valley even without an assault, because the moss fields would be trampled flat within a week. The priest said through Emma that the exiles would not speak with the valley folk because hatred had replaced their memory. But then he added slowly, looking at Dan, "They won't speak with the valley folk. But they might talk to those who speak with the heavens, because their legends also begin with a door." Soul stated with down-to-earth bluntness that negotiations with a mob carrying a broken door as a banner usually end on spears. Dan replied that a crowd is never united, and that a banner signifies an old grudge, and an old grudge signifies an old debt. The people do not choose exile, the people are exiled. And it was the ancestors of the current priests who exiled them. He turned to the priest and asked a question that made the old man flinch. Dan asked why those Irhi had actually been driven out. The answer came after a long silence, and Emma translated it in a near whisper. When the previous wearer of the bracelet became a cruel god, he had loyal servants. An entire clan served him and kept the people in fear of his name. After the wearer was killed, the valley put the servants on trial. The clan was banished to the poison, all of them. The innocent, the guilty, and the children. The banner of the exiles was not a symbol of faith. It was a reminder of injustice. Dan was silent for a long time. Then he said he would go out to meet the column himself. A cry rose up in 2 languages at once. Mia said it was suicide. Laura demanded that they finish the scene first. The priest said that the exiles were killing the valley folk on the spot. Dan listened to everyone and explained his reasoning. The exiles are heading for the door. That means the one who controls the door will speak to them. Not the valley they hate. Not the priests they remember as executioners. But a new bearer who bears no guilt toward them, yet possesses something no one has had for 100 generations. The opportunity to repay a debt. He took only Emma with him as an interpreter, and Irhi, who volunteered to go because a heretic had nothing to lose. Soul insisted on going forth and carried a camera on her shoulder because she said Earth needed to see what real diplomacy looked like. They went out to meet the column at dawn and stopped in an open area by a dry riverbed. Dan ordered them not to raise their hands or back away no matter what happened. The convoy stopped 100 paces away. 5 people broke away from it. Leading the way, standing taller than the rest, was a woman wearing a necklace made of shards of black material. The chieftain. She stopped 5 paces away, and Dan saw her eyes, not animal-like. Tired, angry, and very intelligent. She spoke first, and though her dialect was distorted, Emma could make out the roots of the words. The chieftain said that the door belonged to the loyal, not the traitors. That her people had been coming here for 10 generations, and that she was giving the outsiders one chance to step aside. Dan replied slowly so Emma could keep up. He said he knew why their clan had been exiled, that the innocent had been cast out without trial along with the guilty, that he himself was neither a valley dweller nor a priest. The chief's necklace trembled. Dan continued. He said that the door now belonged to no one because it was broken and dying, and with it the mountain's air was dying, and then everyone would die, both the valley and the exiles. He said he was repairing the door, and that when it came back to life, it would open neither for a clan nor for a caste. He held out his hand with the bracelet and spoke the word that Emma had translated for him beforehand and that he had memorized. A word of promise in the language of Irchi. And he added a second word he had memorized, the word all. The chieftain stared at the bracelet for a long time. Then she looked at her people scattered across the dead plain. Then she did something no one on either side had expected. She removed a necklace made of shards of black material from around her neck, threw it at Dan's feet, and said that the stranger's words were worth testing and that her people would set up camp by the dry riverbed and wait 7 days. If, within 7 days, the door came to life and opened to everyone, then there would be no need for war. If the stranger had lied, then her people would take the mountain and slaughter everyone in the valley, and no heaven would be able to help. She turned and walked toward the column. Dan picked up the necklace and felt the fragments of black material in the bracelet tremble faintly. 7 days. The seam was 9/10 complete. The machine's voice demanded a carrier inside the arch. And that very night, a letter from Kramer arrived through the portal from the Earth side, containing a single line. Instruments are detecting a rise in energy at the transition point, and the decision regarding the expedition has been revised. The group is given the same 7 days. Reconnaissance revealed a column of 800 exiled Irchi, transformed by poison and carrying the banner of the broken door. And the priest revealed that their clan had been exiled without trial for serving a cruel host of. The Dan approached the leader of the exiles, acknowledged the past injustice, and, with a promise, negotiated a 7-day truce until the door was reactivated for everyone, otherwise there would be an assault. At the same time, Kramer reported that Earth was detecting a surge in transition energy and was also granting exactly 7 days before reconsidering the decision regarding the expedition. Those 7 days turned into one long day, with no distinction between day and night. Work beneath the temple was divided into shifts, and no one slept for more than 4 hours at a time. Dan later recalled those days in flashes. Here are Laura and Sol standing on scaffolding at the top of the arch, rubbing paste into the last exposed section of the fault line, both with their hands covered in a gray crust up to their elbows. Here is Emma, in the warmth of the base, cultivating the 6th generation of the culture on glucose. And the colonies are growing so vigorously that the pots have to be changed twice a day. Here, a chain of 40 Urchi from the valley passes baskets of paste from hand to hand down the tunnel like water at a fire. Here, Mia sets up an IV for the old priest who refused to leave the hall and worked until he fainted. And on the 3rd day, by the dry riverbed, something happened that no one had planned for. Mia arrived at the camp of the exiles with a box of medicines and 2 valley porters who were trembling with terror but kept walking. She told Dan before leaving that a truce is held together by words, and words are held together by deeds. At the camp, she found what she had expected. Children of the exiles with growths obstructing their breathing. The poison that the adults had learned to endure was still crippling the children. Mia cut away the growths, inserted drains, and taught the mothers how to rinse the wounds with a baking soda solution. The chief stood over her the entire time she worked and said nothing. And when Mia was about to leave, the chief stopped her, removed a bone knife from her belt, and held out the handle toward her. Emma later explained, using a dictionary, that this gesture signified recognition of kinship. From that day on, the outcasts considered one of those who spoke with the heavens to be one of their own. On the 5th day, the seam closed. The scanner showed a solid structure along the entire length of the fracture. The density of the fused material was even higher than the original, because the culture had reinforced the mineral with layers like mother of pearl. Laura looked at the screen and couldn't bring herself to say aloud that everything was ready. Soul spoke up. She stated dryly that as an observer, she was recording the completion of the repair and that it was now a matter of protocol. And then the machine's voice came to life on its own. It sounded louder and more even now, and its words made everyone in the room hold their breath. Circuit integrity has been restored. The evacuation protocol is ready to be initiated. A key carrier is required at the focal point of the arch for initialization. Attention! While damaged, the protocol was interrupted during the transfer phase. The incomplete transfer will be completed upon initialization. Laura asked the machine to clarify what an unfinished transfer meant. The machine replied indifferently and menacingly. 4 objects were transferred to an external point at the moment of the emergency failure. The return of the objects is part of the protocol. All 4 looked at each other. The machine was talking about them. Their transfer from the museum was no accident. They were cargo stuck in a broken pipe, and the activation of the protocol meant that the pipe would cease to function. Dan asked one last question. He asked what would happen to the key carrier at the focal point of the arch during initialization. The machine fell silent for the first time ever. Then it's said that the carrier becomes part of the circuit during initialization, that during normal operation, the carrier separates from the circuit after completion, and that the probability of normal operation following the repair is unknown. Mia asked in a trembling voice what unknown meant. The machine replied that such a repair was not provided for in the design and that there was no data available. The room grew very quiet. Dan looked at the arch and at the blue pattern on his wrist, which over the past few months had spread all the way to his elbow. He had understood everything, even before the question was asked. The door home would open for everyone. But someone had to step inside it. And that someone might not come out. On the evening of the 6th day, he didn't say anything to the girls. He wrote 3 letters and hid them in Mia's first aid kit, where they would be found later. And that night, Laura woke him up. She was sitting next to him, holding his letters in her hands, her face calm and angry at the same time. She said she'd seen right through him back in the hall, and that if he thought he could sneak through the archway at dawn, then he was the smartest person she knew, and at the same time, the stupidest. Behind her, in the doorway, stood Mia and Emma, fully clothed. The group would make its decision as a group. Less than a day remained until the end of the truce, and by the dry riverbed, 800 exiles were already breaking camp and lining up facing the mountain. The arch's repair was completed in 5 days, and Mia's mercy raid on the exiles' camp had cemented the truce with the chieftain's acknowledgement of blood ties. The machine announced that the transfer of the 4 from the museum was an emergency failure of the evacuation protocol, that the return home is built into the startup, but the key carrier must come into focus within the arch and may not detach from the circuit because there is no data on its operation after the repair. Dan tried to secretly decide to sacrifice himself, but the girls intercepted his letters and demanded a collective decision, while the exiles were already heading toward the mountain. The council convened before dawn right in the hall beneath the temple. Everyone came. The 4 people, Sol, the priest, Urhi, the heretic. And an hour later, at Dan's call, the leader of the exiles descended into the tunnel with 2 elders. The valley guards pressed themselves against the walls as the black and purple figures passed by. But the priest himself stepped out to meet them and made a gesture of welcome. 100 generations of hatred squeezed through a single door for the sake of a common cause, and Emma whispered that this was already a miracle, regardless of the outcome. Dan laid everything out without mincing words. The door is ready. The launch will bring the 4 home and revitalize the contour, and the mountain's air will begin to reclaim the planet from the poison. But the carrier must stand at the focal point of the arch, and the carrier may remain part of the machine forever. He said he'd worn the bracelet longer than anyone else, and the pattern had grown into his skin up to his elbow, so it made sense for him to go. Laura objected with a calculation. She said that the machine applies the term carrier to anyone who puts on the bracelet, which means there are 4 candidates, and the decision should be based not on self-sacrifice, but on the probability of success. And she demanded that the machine provide data on which carrier is preferable. The machine responded with unexpected eagerness. The preferred carrier is the one with maximum key integration. The first carrier's integration level is 71%. The others are less than 5. The figure hit the room like a slab of stone. The pattern on Dan's arm wasn't just a decoration. The bracelet had been growing into him all these months. The machine had already made its choice. Mia quietly asked if the risk could be reduced. And then, the one they least expected to speak up did. The priest. He approached the pedestal that had been brought downstairs before the launch and pointed to the mummified hand of the former carrier and the lifeless bracelet on it. Emma translated slowly because the priest was choosing his words from the oldest of them. The lore of his circle preserved not only the history of the execution, it preserved the machine's words spoken in antiquity. 2 keys are stronger than one: the bearer and the keeper. The former bearer killed his keeper out of jealousy for power, and since then, there has been only 1 key. The door operated at half strength and broke. Laura sat up straight and asked the machine if it was true that the protocol supported paired initialization. The machine confirmed it. Paired initialization distributes the load. The probability of both carriers separating after completion increases exponentially. Activation of the second key is required. Everyone looked at the dead bracelet on the mummy. The spark socket in it was burnt out and black. Soul said that a burnt-out component wasn't a death sentence if there was something to replace it with, and she looked at the chieftain's necklace that Dan had been carrying with him ever since that day by the riverbed. Fragments of black material. The chieftain understood without needing a translation. She was looking at her clan's necklace, which had been passed down for 10 generations, as a reminder of their stolen destiny. She would have taken it off herself, but it was already in Dan's hands, so she simply nodded and said that if the shards of her ancestors could bring the door back to life for everyone, then the exile would finally come to a proper end. Laura and Soul worked on the dead bracelet for 8 hours. The Irhi culture was set upon the scale, and the colonies gnawed the soot out of the nest in 3 hours, accelerated to the limit by glucose. Laura ground the shards of the necklace against the nest, micron by micron. When the last shard fell into place, the dead metal warmed, and a spark smoldered in the nest. Dim, uneven, but alive. The second key existed. One question remained.
One that no one wanted to ask first. Who would put on the second bracelet and stand in the archway next to Dan? They didn't have time to ask. A valley guard came tumbling down the tunnel from above, shouting as he ran.
Emma turned pale as she translated. Smoke was rising from the base. People were marching across the plateau toward the temple. People from Earth, a lot of them, with self-driving vehicles. Kramer didn't wait until the 7th day. Or perhaps someone higher up than Kramer did.
Dan rushed to the exit and saw it all for himself from the ridge by the temple. Across the plateau, from the spot where his portals used to open, a column was advancing. 6-wheeled platforms. 50 figures in full protective gear. Earth had carved a path with its energy along the measured coordinates, just as it had promised. The hole, torn open by brute force, hung over the plateau as a jagged, trembling oval, its edges showering sparks. And the machine beneath the mountain spoke of its own accord, without being asked, and for the first time, its voice sounded rapid. External, unauthorized interference with the transition layer. Circuit integrity is at risk. 40 minutes until critical destabilization. Immediate protocol initialization required. A council of all parties determined that Dan's key integration was at 71%, and the machine selected him. However, the priest's legacy activated the paired mode of the carrier and the keeper, which significantly increases the chances of survival for both. The mummy's broken bracelet was restored using Irhi culture and fragments of the exile's necklace, yielding a second key. The Earth faction didn't wait for the deadline and forced open their own crude portal onto the plateau, triggering a destabilization of the circuit. 40 minutes remained until initialization. As always during the worst moments of his life, Dan broke down the 40 minutes into tasks in his head. The first task was to stop the column before it reached the temple. The second was to decide who would take the second bracelet. The third was to have time to say goodbye if the decision turned out the way it was bound to. He assigned roles on the fly. Sol and Emma would go to meet the Earthlings because Sol had the authority of an observer, and Emma had the vocabulary and the face of someone they trusted. Laura and the priest were preparing the hall for launch. Mia maintained communication between the surface and the depths using the portable radios. The leader of the exiles did something no one had asked her to do. She led her 800 to the ridges on either side of the path to the temple. Not for an attack, for the spectacle. When the Earth column reached the foot of the cliffs, it saw a silent wall of black and purple figures above them on the rocks, and stopped of its own accord without a single shot being fired. Sol stepped forward with her camera raised and spoke into the column's radio for 7 minutes. Dan never caught all the words, but he understood the outcome. The platforms shut down their engines. The convoy commander agreed to their status as witnesses and to a 100-step buffer zone leading up to the temple, which the Earthlings would not cross. It also helped that the jagged oval of their shattered portal was visibly losing its shape before their eyes. And the convoy's physicists were the first to realize that a crude door could bring down a mountain, and that only those inside knew how to repair it. That left a second option, and they had 12 minutes to decide. In the hall by the arch, Dan picked up the restored bracelet and scanned those standing nearby. He said he had no right to appoint anyone. 3 of them stepped forward at the same time: Laura, Mia, and Emma. And then something happened that even Dan hadn't foreseen. A 4th person stepped forward. Eerie, the heretic. He spoke, and Emma translated, her voice breaking. Eerie said that, according to legend, the keeper must be from the people of this land because the door stands on this land. That he didn't believe in the god from the arch, and he was right because the arch turned out to be a machine. That all his life he had wanted only one thing: to understand. And that there was no way to understand more deeply than by becoming part of the answer. The priest, who had spent his entire life regarding heretics as a disgrace to the circle, approached and touched Erie's wrist with his own. The highest honor for Erie. The machine settled the dispute before the people could. It declared that the proposed host's compatibility with the local circuit was 94%, and that this was the optimal configuration. The planet was choosing its own. Dan slipped the second bracelet onto his slender gray wrist himself, and he asked through Emma one last time if he was sure. He replied briefly. Emma translated it even more succinctly. He said that for the first time in his life, he was standing exactly where he was supposed to be. There were 4 minutes left. And then Mia did something that left everyone speechless. She hugged Dan and said that if he didn't walk through that archway, she'd come back here through any door and pull him out herself, because he'd already pulled her out once before. Laura didn't hug him. Laura slipped a folded piece of paper into his pocket and said that it contained probability calculations, that the numbers looked good, and that she was never wrong. But if he made her wrong for the first time, she wouldn't forgive him. Emma just stood next to Uri, translating everything for him as she cried without wiping away her tears. Dan and Uri entered the arch from opposite sides and stood in the spotlight, back to back. The human and the stranger. The bearer and the keeper. The bracelets flashed simultaneously, and the patterns on their 2 wrists glowed through their skin, their light stretching toward each other through the air. The machine began a countdown in 2 languages at once, and only at that very moment did Dan realize that it had always been able to speak Erie's language and had remained silent for centuries simply because no one had asked. Light filled the archway. Through the white glow, Dan caught a glimpse of Earthlings in protective suits peering down into the hall from above, of the priest and the chieftain of the exiles standing shoulder to shoulder, and of 3 young women holding hands. And then the world vanished. there was no longer any top or bottom. Everything became visible at once. He saw the mountain from the inside as if it were his own body. He saw the machine's veins extending beneath the planet's entire crust. He saw the poison in the sky like a disease in the blood, and he saw the antidote already spreading through the veins from the revived heart. He saw Earth at the other end of a taut thread, his city, his mother at the window. And beside him in this boundless vision, he sensed a calm, attentive presence. He was here. He finally understood. And in the very depths of the light, the machine's voice uttered the final phrase of the countdown. Initialization, transfer, protocol completion. The Earth column was stopped without a fight by a wall of exiles on the ridges, and through negotiations, Sol secured for the Earthlings the status of witnesses within 100 steps. The second host became Irhi, the heretic with 94% compatibility, as the guardian chosen by the people of the planet. Dan and Irhi entered the Ark's focus. Initialization was launched. The circuit came to life and began purifying the atmosphere, and the protocol entered the transfer and completion phases. The light did not fade immediately. It flowed down the walls of the hall in long waves, and with each wave, the air changed. Mia was the first to notice it. Her gas analyzer, which she had kept on automatically for the past few hours, beeped, and she looked at the scale, couldn't believe her eyes, and tapped the casing. The acid vapors in the hall were dropping before their very eyes. The mountain was breathing, exhaling purity. And then the waves of light faded, and everyone saw the arch. The arch stood, alive. A blue thread burned evenly along its outline, and inside the opening, a transparent haze shimmered like the air above a summer road. And standing in the center of the arch were two figures. They were standing, on their own 2 feet. Dan swayed and took a step outward, and Irhi stepped after him. Both stepped out of the opening and remained themselves. The bracelets on their wrists crumbled into gray dust simultaneously and settled onto the stones. The pattern on Dan's arm glowed for another minute, then faded, becoming simply a thin white scar running from his wrist to his elbow. Irhi was left with one just like it. The machine announced matter-of-factly that the protocol was complete, that the hosts had been separated, and that the system was operating normally. Laura was the first to run up and cling to Dan, shaking him, repeating that the numbers were good and that she was never wrong. Then she pulled away and punched him in the shoulder for the 3 letters. Then she hugged him again. Everything else merged into a single hum in 3 languages. The priest was singing. The exiles on the ridges struck the rock with their spears in unison, and the sound rolled through the valley like a heartbeat. The Earthlings stood 100 paces away from their section, their helmets removed, because their instruments had already indicated that the air near the temple had become breathable, and some of them were weeping openly, without restraint. But true silence came with the inspection of the door. The machine explained the new procedure in simple terms. The arch maintains a stable passage between fixed points. It opens on demand from either side. There are no longer any restrictions. Dan approached the haze and named a point, the Aerospace Museum Hall. The haze cleared like a wiped-clean window, and beyond it opened that very hall with satellite models and a meteorite fragment in a display case. An empty morning hall on Earth. The door home stood open, in no hurry to go anywhere. Mia stepped toward the doorway, stopped right at the threshold, and turned around. And she said what all 4 of them had been keeping silent about. She said that Mom and Dad were there and home, and her whole life. But here there was the infirmary, Irhi's children, and the unhealed girl from the camp of the exiled. And that she would walk through that door today, hug her parents, and return tomorrow morning, because the door was no longer a choice for life, but simply a door. The days that followed became a time of returns and first bridges. The tapestry of those days was woven from scenes that would have been impossible just a year ago. Here is Laura standing in the middle of her living room, and her father, who had seen her for just a minute in the warehouse portal, holds her by the shoulders, and doesn't let go for an hour. Here is Emma leading her aunt, the veterinarian, through the archway. And her aunt, wearing the protective suit of Earth's first guest, examines the animals exiled to bone cages and giggles with delight like a little girl. Here is Kramer, personally bringing a box of documents to the arch from his side. And in the documents are the zone's status, a ban on military presence, and a scientific exchange program signed at such a high level that Sol whistles. Here are the leader of the exiles and the old priest sitting across from each other in the Valley Square. And between them lies the necklace that returned from the machine after launch. And they speak. They simply speak. For the first time in 100 generations. And on the evening of the 9th day after the launch, Irhi came to Dan on the ridge where he loved to sit. They now understood each other almost without Emma, because the connection they had experienced inside the contour had left both of them with something like a shared memory. Irhi said that during the merger, the machine had shown him more than just this mountain. 4 more such circuits lie dormant across the planet. 4 dead mountains above poison lands where Irhi once lived as well. This mountain's machine can now awaken them, but they'll have to be roused by hand. Traveling in caravans through those poison. Repairing. Install the keys. A generation's worth of work. Dan looked out at the valley where, beneath the crimson sunset, the campfires of the valley dwellers and the exiles burned side by side with the lights of the Earth's scientific camp. And he felt something rising inside him, not fatigue, but its opposite. He asked Irhi when the first caravan would set out. Irhi replied that it would be in the spring, when the roads through the dead lands had dried out. He added that the keeper needed a carrier. Dan smiled wryly and said he'd think about it. They both knew that meant yes. And down below, by the arch, his mother was standing at that very moment. She had walked through the door for the first time an hour ago, and Mia had led her by the hand across the valley, showing her the world her son had saved. And Dan rose from the rock and walked down to meet her, because some encounters are more important than all the contours of the universe. The initialization went smoothly. Dan and Irhi emerged from the arch alive. Their bracelets crumbled away, leaving behind scar-like patterns, and the contour began to purify the atmosphere, turning the arch into a permanent gateway with no time limit. The era of bridges began, a return to families, a treaty with Earth establishing the zone's status as a no-military presence zone, and the first dialogue between the valley dwellers and the exiles. Through the merger, Irhi learned of 4 dormant contours on the planet, and in the spring, a caravan is being prepared to awaken them. He called on Dan to serve as the carrier, and Dan's mother passed through the door for the first time. Spring on the planet Irhi turned out to be violet. When the poison in the sky receded, clean rain fell over the valley for the first time in centuries, and within a single lunar cycle, the dead slopes were covered with a carpet of wild moss in every shade, from lilac to nearly blue. Emma walked along these slopes as if in a dream, recording descriptions of sights that no human eye had ever seen into her voice recorder. And her first scientific article, written at the age of 17, already existed in both worlds at once. The caravan set out for the nearest dead mountain in early spring, just as had been decided. 40 valley folk and 40 exiles marched in a single column, and that in itself was worth any miracle the machine could produce. Dan walked ahead beside Irhi, carrying on his wrist a new key grown by the machine over the winter. The journey took 2 months and was arduous. During it, they buried 2 of their own, froze, and lost their sleds in the acidic swamps. But at the end of the journey, in the hall beneath the second mountain, Dan and Irhi once again came into focus within a foreign arch, and once again emerged from the light on their own 2 feet. The second mountain began to breathe. From its slopes, the poison began to recede just as it had from the first. And at the foot of the mountain, the families of the exiles, for whom this was the land of their great-grandfathers, remained to build a new valley. The caravan's return turned into a celebration of 2 worlds. During the expedition, a veritable village of bridges had sprung up near the first arch. Earthen domes and Irhi domes stood side by side, and in the square between them, a school was in session where Emma taught children of both peoples. while Laura led a joint chemistry and materials science class for both Earthlings and Urhi, because the culture of the pasty had already revolutionized Earth's construction methods, and the tent was designated for the entire Urhi people, which had been Laura's condition during the negotiations, and she hadn't budged an inch on that point. Mia had completed her high school studies as an external student, enrolled in medical school, and lived in two worlds separated by a door. In the morning, she attended lectures on Earth. In the evening, she made rounds at the Valley Infirmary, where 6 trained Uri healers worked under her supervision, 2 of whom were from the exiled people. Sol led the permanent scientific mission, and in her reports, the planet was referred to not as an object, but as a partner, a formulation that had been approved at the very highest levels. Kramer came through the door once a month to drink tea with Dan's mother, who had moved to the village of Bridges permanently and was growing earth tomatoes in a dome, which the Irhi considered an impossible treasure, and gave to one another, one at a time, on major holidays. In the summer, the day they had been planning for a year finally arrived. Open House Day. By decision of both worlds, the arch was opened for a day to the ordinary people of Earth, not for scientists, not for officials, but for the families of those involved. The first to walk through the door was the old security guard from the hypermarket who had once shouted after a young man carrying an armful of respirators. Dan met him on the other side himself and led him through the valley, and the old man gazed at the 2 moons above the violet slopes and kept repeating that he'd thought his whole life he'd caught a thief. But it turned out he'd witnessed the beginning of it all. That evening, everyone gathered in the square of the village of Bridges. 4 former students sat on the ridge above the square, just as they had during the hardest days, and looked down at the lights. Laura said she'd done the math. Exactly 400 days had passed since the moment the museum floor vanished beneath their feet. Mia said that if she'd been given a choice back then, she would have given anything to prevent the teleportation from happening. And that now, she wouldn't give up those 400 days for anything. Emma asked Dan what he was thinking about. Dan was thinking about many things. About the 3rd, 4th, and 5th mountains, which were waiting for their caravans and their keys, work that would take years, and that he was right where he belonged in that work. About the words the old priest had spoken to him after the 2nd mountain. The priest said that the Irhi people had waited for centuries for a god to come through the door. But a man had come who refused to be a god and therefore managed to become a friend, and that this was the entire answer that 100 generations had been searching for. About the girl from the exiled people whom Mia had healed, and who now attends Emma's school and draws a rectangle with rays in her notebook. But the figures next to the rectangle do not prostrate, but are holding hands. But out loud, he said something else. He said he was thinking about that day at the museum. How he'd been walking behind 3 classmates who didn't know his name. The quiet kid in the back row whom no one would have bet even a broken coin on? Laura snorted and said she remembered asking him how he knew about aldehydes and still hadn't gotten an answer. Dan smiled and finally replied. He said he'd simply spent his whole life reading about everything under the sun, because as he put it, quiet people have plenty of time to read, and that no knowledge is ever superfluous. There's just knowledge that hasn't yet found its moment. Down below in the square, children from both worlds were launching lanterns into the dark sky. Earth's paper ones and urchis made of glowing moss. The lights rose in a jumble, and from the height of the ridge, it was already impossible to tell which came from which world. The door in the arch behind them glowed with an even blue thread, open in both directions, in no hurry. Just a door between 2 homes. Dan looked at the lights and knew that the story of the 4 stranded on a toxic planet had ended. Because the planet was no longer toxic. And because they were no longer stranded. They were home. On both sides of the door. In the spring, the caravan of the valley dwellers and the exiles, led by Dan and Irhi, awakened the 2nd mountain, beginning the planet's purification, and at the first arch, a settlement of Bridges sprang up, complete with a school, an infirmary, and a scientific mission, where the patent for the pasta culture is held by the people of Irhi. All lines are closed. Mia is studying for 2 worlds. Laura leads the scientific efforts. Emma runs the school and catalogs the species. Dan's mother moved through the door, and the exiles found the land of their ancestors. On Open Door Day, 400 days after the transfer, the heroes realized they had achieved their main goal. The planet is healing, the 2 worlds are united in an equal alliance, and the door has become not a means of salvation, but simply a path between the 240 minutes unfolded in Dan's mind as a series of tasks, as always, during the worst moments of his life. The first task was to stop the procession before it reached the temple. The second was to decide who would take the second bracelet. The third was to have time to say goodbye if the decision turned out to be what it was bound to be. He assigned roles on the run as they climbed the worn steps out of the hall. Sol and Emma would go to meet the Earthlings because Sol had the authority of an observer, and Emma had the vocabulary and the face of someone people trusted. Laura and the priest were preparing the hall for launch. Mia maintained communication between the surface and the depths via the portable radios. He looked each of them in the eye for a second, and each nodded and ran on. And Dan had time to think that a year ago, these same people wouldn't have trusted him to even carry a briefcase. The leader of the exiles did something no one had asked her to do. She led her 800 to the ridges on either side of the trail leading to the temple. Not for an attack, for the spectacle. She understood the power of spectacle better than any Earth general. When the Earth column approached the foot of the ridges, they saw above them on the cliffs a silent wall of black. Purple figures standing motionless against the crimson sky, and the column stopped of its own accord without a single shot fired and without a single command. Sol stepped forward with her camera raised and spoke into the column's radio for 7 minutes. Dan stood 100 paces behind and couldn't hear her words, but he saw how the posture of the people by the platforms was changing, how their weapons were being lowered, how the convoy leader took off his glove and rubbed his face with his palm. Later, Sol recounted her main argument. She told them that in 1 year, 4 children had done here what makes a civilization, while the column could do in 40 minutes what makes a crowd, and that this choice would end up in the textbooks either way. So let everyone decide on which page they wanted to be remembered. It also helped that the torn oval of the breached portal was losing its shape before their eyes. Its edges no longer sparkled but were consumed, burned with a steady, malevolent fire. And the column's physicists were the first to realize that a crude door could bring down a mountain, and that only those on the inside know how to repair it. The Elder agreed to their status as witnesses and to a 100-step buffer zone leading up to the temple that the Earthlings would not cross. A second decision remained, and they had 12 minutes to make it. In the hall by the arch, Dan picked up the restored bracelet, and the metal was warm like a living hand. He glanced around at those standing nearby, and he said that he had no right to appoint anyone. That a second key meant a second risk, and one could only risk oneself. 3 of them stepped forward at the same time: Laura, Mia, and Emma. None of them looked at the others. Each stepped forward as if she were alone in the hall. Dan's throat tightened, and he opened his mouth to refuse all 3 at once. But then something happened that even he hadn't anticipated. A 4th person stepped forward. Ari the heretic. He emerged from the shadows by the wall where the entire council had been standing and began to speak, and Emma translated, her voice breaking every other sentence. Irhi said that, according to legend, the guardian must be from the people of this land because the door stands on this land, and the door's roots drink from this land. That he had been wrong his whole life. He didn't believe in the god of the arch when everyone else did. He asked questions when he was supposed to be singing. He went out at night to the strangers when his own people turned their backs on him. And he turned out to be right about everything, because the arch turned out to be a machine, and the strangers turned out to be friends. That his whole life he had wanted only one thing: to understand. To understand how light works, why the wind blows, and what lies beyond the mountains and the sky. And that there is no way to understand more deeply than to become part of the answer itself. He spoke, and such silence fell over the hall that you could hear the oil crackling in the bowls. The priest, who had spent his entire life regarding the heretic as a disgrace to the circle and had expelled him from the temple 3 times, approached him across the entire hall. The old man moved slowly, and everyone waited for a blow or a curse. The priest touched the heretic's wrist with his own and held the touch for a moment. The highest honor of Irhi, the recognition of an equal by an equal. Emma later said that in that very second, she understood why it was worth getting stranded on another planet. The machine settled the dispute before the people could. It stated in an even voice that the proposed carrier's compatibility with the local circuit was 94%, and that this was the optimal configuration among all those present. The planet was choosing its own. Dan slipped the second bracelet onto his slender gray wrist himself and fastened the clasp. The bracelet came to life and stretched, its pattern conforming to Irhi's skin, just as it once had to his own. And he asked through Emma one last time if he was sure, because there might be no turning back. Irhi replied briefly. Emma translated even more briefly and wiped her face with her sleeve. He said that for the first time in his life, he was standing exactly where he was meant to be. There were 4 minutes left, and the machine was counting them down aloud. And then Mia did something that left everyone speechless. She hugged Dan tightly, as if he were her brother, and said that if he didn't step out of that archway, she would return here through any door, no matter how many years passed, and pull him out herself, because he had already pulled her out once, and she always repays her debts. Laura didn't hug him. Laura slipped a sheet of paper folded in 4 into his pocket and said that it contained the probability calculations for paired initialization, that the numbers looked good, and that she was never wrong. And if he made her wrong for the first time in her life, she would never forgive him for the rest of her days. Her voice was steady, but her hands weren't. Emma just stood next to Irhi and translated everything for him. Every word, every joke, every threat from Laura, and cried without wiping away her tears. And Irhi listened and nodded slightly, his large eyes reflecting the fire from the bowls. Sol, with a camera slung over her shoulder, moved back toward the wall and said she was recording it and that someday school children from both worlds would watch it. From above, the voice of the Earth Column's commander came over the radio. He said his men were standing on the runway, and that if blood was needed for transfusions or hands to carry things, 50 donors and porters were awaiting orders. Dan took the radio and replied that only one thing was needed. Witnesses. Watch closely. Dan and Uri entered the arch from opposite sides and stood in the spotlight back to back. A human and an alien, the bearer and the keeper. Dan felt the warmth of the alien's body against his back, and that warmth was the same temperature as a human's. For some reason, it was precisely this small detail that calmed him. The bracelets flashed simultaneously, and the patterns on both wrists glowed there through the skin, the light stretching toward each other through the air until they closed into a ring around both of them. The machine began a countdown in 2 languages at once, and it was only at that moment that Dan realized it had always been able to speak the language of the Eerie and had remained silent for centuries simply because no one had asked. No one had simply asked. Light filled the arch from the floor to the keystone. Through the white glow, Dan caught a glimpse of Earthlings in protective suits peering into the hall from above, and one of them was taking off his helmet, defying all instructions.
Like a priest and a chieftain of the exiles, they stood shoulder to shoulder, both their lips moving, as each prayed to his own god. Like 3 girls holding hands so tightly, their fingers turned white. And then the world vanished. There was no longer any top or bottom, and there was no longer a body. Everything became visible at once. He saw the mountain from the inside, as if it were his own body. He saw the machine's veins running beneath the planet's entire crust, thinner than a hair and thicker than a river. He saw poison in the sky, like a disease in the blood, and he saw the antidote spreading through the veins from the revived heart in a slow, warm wave. He saw the earth at the other end of a taut thread. His city from above, his home, his mother by the window, a cup in her hands. He saw the torn hole in the earth's portal,
and felt it like a splinter in the palm of his hand. And he saw how the outline gently embraced its edges, dampening and closing it off. And beside him in this boundless vision, he sensed a calm, attentive presence. Irhi was here. Irhi looked at all of this and was not afraid. Irhi finally understood.
And his understanding was so vast and so joyful that it was enough for two. And in the very depths of the light, the machine's voice uttered the final phrase of the countdown. Initialization. Transfer. Protocol complete. The Earth column was stopped without a fight by a wall of exiles on the ridges, and after 7 minutes of negotiations, Sol secured for the Earthlings the status of witnesses 100 paces away, while their torn portal began to crumble, confirming the group's correctness. Irhi, the heretic with 94% compatibility, volunteered to be the second carrier, receiving from the A gesture of the highest honor, while the girls bid Dan farewell with a letter of reckoning, a promise to rescue him, and tears. Dan and Irhi stood at the focal point of the arch, back to back. The initialization began. In a vision of merging, Dan saw the machine's veins beneath the entire planet, the beginning of the sky's purification, the closing of the Earth's breach, and nearby, Irhi's blissful realization. The light did not fade immediately. It trickled down the walls of the hall in long waves, like water from a dome after a downpour. And with each wave, the air changed. Mia was the first to realize it. Her gas analyzer, which she had kept on automatically for the past few hours, beeped, and she looked at the gauge, couldn't believe her eyes, tapped the casing, and looked again. The acid fumes in the hall were dropping before her very eyes. The needle crept downward steadily and inexorably, as if someone enormous were taking one breath after another, drawing the poison out with each one. The mountain was breathing in and breathing out purity. And then the waves of light faded, and everyone saw the arch. The arch stood, alive. A blue thread burned evenly along its outline without a single break, and where a crack had gaped for months, the thread was even brighter, as if the machine took pride in the seam. Inside the opening, a transparent haze shimmered like the air above a summer road. And in the center of the arch stood two people. They stood, on their feet. For a full second, no one moved or breathed. Then Dan swayed and took a step outward. His legs held him, and Irhi stepped after him, and both emerged from the opening and remained themselves. The bracelets on their wrists crumbled into gray dust simultaneously and settled on the stones of the hall in a thin ring. The pattern on Dan's arm glowed for another minute through his sleeve before fading away, becoming simply a thin white scar stretching from his wrist to his elbow. Irhi was left with one just like it, and he examined his scar with such delight as if he'd been awarded a medal. The machine announced matter-of-factly that the protocol was complete, that the carriers had been separated, that the circuit was operating normally, and that the estimated time for complete purification of the planet's atmosphere was 11 years. 11 years, and the sky would simply be the sky. Laura was the first to run up. She clung to Dan, shook him by the shoulders, and kept repeating that the numbers were good and that she was never wrong. Never, do you hear me? Never. Then she pulled away and punched him in the shoulder for the 3 hidden letters. Then she hugged him again and said nothing more. Mia checked his pupils and pulse right there in their embrace because the doctor in her never switched off, even through her tears. Emma hugged Irhi, and Irhi stood there, bewildered, because his people didn't hug, and then slowly and very carefully placed his 4-fingered hand on the back of her head. And it was the first exchange of gestures of warmth between the two species, and Sol filmed it with trembling hands. What followed merged into a single hum in 3 languages. The priest sang. He stood by the pedestal holding the hand of the former bearer, and sang an ancient song of the circle that Emma could not translate because her vocabulary lacked such words. And then the priest did something that no one had done for 100 generations. He took the mummified hand, carried it out of the hall and up the hill, and buried it in a field of moss near the temple. The watch was over. There was nothing left to guard. The exiles on the ridges struck the stone with their spears in unison, and the sound rolled through the valley like a heartbeat. Those in the valley below picked up the rhythm with their palms, and for the first time, the two peoples sounded as one. The Earthlings stood 100 paces from their line, having removed their helmets because their instruments had already indicated that the air near the temple had become breathable, and some of them wept openly without restraint. The leader of the column approached the very edge of the line and asked permission to take one step further. Dan granted permission, and the leader took that step and said he wouldn't go any further, because going further had to be earned. But true silence came when the door was inspected. The machine explained the new procedure in simple terms. The arch maintains a steady passage between fixed points. Opens on request from either side. Unlimited throughput. Time limit removed. Dan asked for the words, "Time limit removed," to be repeated twice. Their year of life here had been sliced into 60-second segments. For a year, they'd lived from minute to minute. And now the minute was over, and time had begun. Dan approached the haze and named a point, the Aerospace Museum Hall. The haze cleared like a polished window, and beyond it lay that very hall with its satellite models and a meteorite fragment in a display case. An empty morning hall on Earth, where a year ago, 4 schoolchildren had fallen through the floor. The door home stood open, in no hurry to go anywhere. No countdown in the corner. No numbers. Just a door. Mia stepped toward the doorway and stopped right at the boundary where the stone of the alien planet ended and the parquet floor of the Earth Museum began, then turned around. And she said what all 4 of them had been keeping silent about. She said that Mom and Dad were there, and home, and her whole former life, and that for a year she'd only seen them in her dreams. But here there was the infirmary, Irhi's children, and the girl from the camp of the exiled, who hadn't finished her treatment and was due for a dressing change tomorrow. And that she would walk through that door today, hug her parents, cry her heart out for a whole year's worth of tears, and return tomorrow morning for her dressing change, because the door was no longer a choice for life, but simply a door. And that is the whole difference between salvation and life. The days that followed became a time of returns and first bridges. The tapestry of those days was woven from scenes that, just a year ago, would have been impossible. Here is Laura, standing in the middle of her living room, and her father, who saw her for a minute in the warehouse portal, holds her by the shoulders at arm's length, staring and staring, not letting go for an hour. And her mother sets the table with trembling hands and places a 4th place setting out of habit for her missing daughter. And Laura says that the place setting isn't extra because tomorrow she'll be bringing guests. Here's Emma leading her aunt, a veterinarian, through the arch. And her aunt, wearing the protective suit of Earth's first civilian guest, examines the exiled animals in their bone cages and giggles with delight like a little girl. And a week later, she's already arguing with Emma about classification as equals. Here, Mia's parents are standing in front of the arch on the Earth side, hesitating. And Mia takes them by the hand and leads them into the haze. And her mother steps out onto the rocks of a foreign planet. And the first thing she sees is a line of gray-haired mothers with children outside her daughter's infirmary. And she understands everything without a single word. Here, Kramer personally brings a box of documents to the arch from his side. And the documents contain the zone's status, a ban on military presence, and a scientific exchange program signed by such high-ranking officials that Sol whistles and says she hasn't seen signatures like these in 20 years of service. Here, the leader of the exiles and the old priest sit facing each other in the valley square. And between them lies the necklace that returned from the machine intact after launch, and they speak. They simply talk. For an hour, then another, then a third. For the first time in 100 generations. Emma didn't translate this for anyone because some conversations aren't meant for dictionaries. And on the evening of the 9th day after the launch, Urhi came to Dan on the ridge where he loved to sit. They now understood each other almost without Emma, because the connection they'd experienced within the circuit had left both of them with something like a shared memory at the bottom of their consciousness. Words were still needed, but the meanings came before the words. Erie sat down next to him on a rock, human-like, dangling his legs, a habit he'd picked up from Dan, and said that during the merger, the machine had shown him more than just this mountain. 4 more such circuits lie dormant across the planet. 4 dead mountains above poisoned lands where Irhi once lived as well, and where cities once stood that are no longer there. This mountain's machine can now awaken them, but we'll have to do the waking by hand. We'll have to travel in caravans through the poison, carry the culture of the herdsman, tools, and the new keys that the machine promised to grow by spring, repair what has been broken for longer than living memory. A task for a generation, or perhaps 2. Dan looked out at the valley where, beneath the crimson sunset, the campfires of the valley dwellers and the exiles burned side by side, along with the lights of the Earth's scientific camp and the windows of the settlement that did not yet have a name. And he felt something rising within him, not fatigue, but something opposite to fatigue. He asked Irhi when the first caravan would set out. Irhi replied that it would be in the spring, when the roads through the Deadlands had dried up and the stars would align to mark the path. After a pause, he added that the keeper needed a carrier, because 2 are stronger than 1, and that this was now a law encoded in the machine itself. Dan smiled wryly and said he'd think about it. Both knew that meant yes. And down below, by the arch, at that very moment, stood his mother. She had walked through the door an hour ago, overcoming her fear of the mirage for the first time, and Mia had led her by the hand across the valley, showing her the world that her son had saved, and that her son had been saved by. And Dan rose from the rock and walked down to meet her, not bothering to follow the trail, because some encounters are more important than all outlines of the universe. The initialization proceeded as planned. Dan and Irhi emerged from the arch alive. The bracelets crumbled, leaving behind scar-like patterns. The contour began purifying the atmosphere with an estimated duration of 11 years, and the arch became a permanent gateway with no time limit. The priest buried the hand of the former bearer, ending his centuries-long vigil. The Age of Bridges began. A return to families, a treaty with Earth establishing the zone's status as a no-military presence area, the first civilian guests, and the first conversation in 100 generations between the leader of the exiles and the priest. Through the fusion, Irhi learned of 4 dormant contours on the planet, and in the spring, a caravan is being prepared to awaken them. He invited Dan to join as the bearer according to the law of pairs, and Dan's mother stepped through the door for the first time and saw her son's world. Spring on the planet. Irhi turned out to be violet. When the poison in the sky receded from the valley for a day's journey in all directions, pure rain fell over the mountain for the first time in centuries, and within a single moon, the dead slopes were covered with a carpet of wild moss in every shade from lilac to nearly blue. The elders of Irhi went out onto the slopes and touched the moss, unable to believe their eyes. And the oldest among them said that he had seen such colors only on sacred carvings, and had considered them a figment of his ancestors' imagination his entire life. Emma walked along these slopes as if through a miracle and spoke into her voice recorder, describing sights that no earthly eye had ever seen. And her first scientific article, written at the age of 17, already existed in 2 worlds at once, in an earthly journal and in the New School of the Valley, rewritten in Urchi symbols. The caravan set out for the nearest dead mountain in early spring, just as had been decided. 40 valley dwellers and 40 exiles marched in a single column. And that in itself was worth any miracle a machine could perform. Back in the fall, these peoples hadn't even looked each other in the eye. Now they shared their sleds, water, and sleeping quarters. Dan walked ahead beside Irhi, wearing on his wrist a new key grown by the machine over the winter. The key was lighter than the old bracelet and fit the scar pattern like a glove, as if his hand had been preparing for it for a year. The journey took 2 months and was arduous and honest. During it, they buried 2 people. An old porter from the Valley people who had been taken by fever, and a young scout from the exiles who had fallen into an acid swamp. Both peoples buried her together, and the priest sang the valley's funeral song over the exile. And the chieftain did not stop him. Along the way, they froze on the mountain passes and lost their sleds. And in the fourth week, Dan led the caravan through a dust storm, relying on his memory of the confluence, because his eyes could see no farther than his outstretched hand, but the machine's memory recalled every stone. But at the end of the journey, in the hall beneath the second mountain, everything repeated itself as promised. Dan and Irhi came into focus within the strange arch, back to back, and once again there was light, and once again there was a vision of the planet's veins, and once again they both stepped out of the light on their own 2 feet. The second mountain began to breathe. From its slopes, the poison began to recede just as it had from the first, and the machine of the second mountain greeted the machine of the first through the veins, and Dan felt that handshake through his own scar. And at the foot of the mountain, they remained to build a new valley for the exiled family, for whom this was the land of their great-grandfathers. The chieftain stood at the spot where, according to legend, her clan's home had once stood. She was silent for a very long time, and then she told Dan that exile ends not when you are forgiven, but when you return and rebuild. The caravan's return turned into a celebration of 2 worlds. During the journey, a veritable village of bridges had sprung up at the first arch. Earth domes and Irhi domes stood intermingled, and it was no longer possible to tell where one style ended and another began, because the builders had been borrowing ideas from one another. In the square between the domes, there was a school where Emma taught children of both peoples. And in her classroom, an Earth girl and a little Irhi boy sat at the same desk and quarreled over colored pencils, just as desk mates are wont to do. Laura taught a joint chemistry and materials science class for the Earthlings and the Irhi, because the paste technology had already revolutionized Earth's construction industry. And the patent for it had been registered in the name of the entire Irhi people, which had been Laura's non-negotiable condition during the negotiations. She did not budge an inch on this condition, and when the Earth Corporation tried to circumvent the patent, Laura, within a week, she gathered evidence, and the corporation publicly apologized and paid the Urchi people enough that a hospital was built in the valley with that money. Mia graduated from school as an external student, enrolled in medical school, and lived a double life separated by a single door. In the morning, she attended lectures on Earth. In the evening, she made rounds at the valley's infirmary, where 6 trained Urchi healers worked under her supervision, 2 of whom were from the exiled people, and the senior healer wore a bone knife on her belt, a gift she had received when Mia's chieftain, because Mia had passed it on to her, saying that the recognition of blood is passed down through deeds. Sol headed the permanent scientific mission, and in her reports, the planet was referred to not as an object, but as a partner. This wording was approved at the very highest levels and incorporated into international documents. Kramer came through the door once a month, no longer in uniform, and drank tea with Dan's mother, who had moved to the village of Bridges for good and was growing Earth tomatoes, which the Irhi considered an impossible treasure and gave to one another, one at a time, on major holidays. And Dan's mother laughed that she had raised a son who had opened a door between worlds but had become famous for her tomatoes. In the summer, the day they'd been planning for a year finally arrived. Open house day. By decision of both worlds, the arch was opened for a day to the ordinary people of Earth. Not for scientists, not for officials, and not for journalists. For the families of those involved, and for those whom the Irhi themselves had chosen from their own lists that no one had edited. The first to walk through the door was an old supermarket security guard who, when once shouted after a guy carrying a bunch of respirators, and then spent half a year testifying about glowing holes, but no one listened to him. Dan met him on the other side himself, and personally guided him through the valley. And the old man looked at the 2 moons above the violet slopes, and at the Irhi children playing with an earth ball, repeating that his whole life he'd thought he was chasing a thief. But it turned out he'd witnessed the beginning of all this, and that now he had a story to tell his grandchildren, and they would finally believe him. That evening, everyone gathered in the square of the village of Bridges. 4 former schoolmates climbed to the ridge above the square and sat down, just as they, in the hardest days of their lives, shoulder to shoulder, and looked down at the lights. Laura said she had counted. Exactly 400 days had passed since the moment the museum floor vanished beneath their feet. 400 days. 26 trips through the minute-long portals. 1 poisoned world that had begun to recover. Two peoples who were no longer enemies. 3 mountains ahead. She said that for the first time in her life, the numbers added up to something more than just the answer to a problem. Mia said that if she'd been given a choice back at the museum, she would have given anything to prevent the transfer from happening. And that now she wouldn't trade those 400 days for anything. And that the strangest thing was feeling grateful for the worst day of her life. Emma hadn't been counting anything. Emma asked Dan what he was thinking about. Dan was thinking about many things, about the 3rd, 4th, and 5th mountains that were waiting for their caravans and their keys. And this was work that would take years. And he was in his place in this work more than ever before, and more than anywhere else. About the words the old priest had spoken to him after the 2nd mountain. The priest said that the people of Urhi had waited for centuries for a god to come through the door. But a man had come who refused to be a god and therefore managed to become a friend. And that this was the very answer that 100 generations had sought. And that the carvers were already carving this answer onto the new stones of the temple. About the girl from the exiled people whom Mia had healed, and who now attends Emma's school and draws a rectangle with rays in her notebook. But the figures next to the rectangle aren't prostrating, they're holding hands. And there's already a whole wall full of such drawings at the school. About Erhai, who was down in the square right now, showing the children of both worlds how the key works, and wasn't afraid of questions because questions had ceased to be heresy and had become a lesson. But out loud, he said something else. He said he was thinking about that day at the museum, how he'd been walking last behind 3 classmates who didn't know his name, the quiet kid in the back row whom no one would have given a broken coin for, how he turned after them, toward the display case with the meteorite without even knowing why. Laura snorted and said she remembered how she'd asked him again and again, how he knew about aldehydes. And even now, 400 days later, she still hadn't received an answer. And that was the only unsolved problem on her list. Dan smiled and finally answered. He said he'd simply spent his whole life reading about everything under the sun because, as a quiet person, he had plenty of time to read. And that no knowledge is ever superfluous. There's just knowledge that hasn't yet found its moment. He'd had 26 such moments. Down below in the square, children from both worlds were launching lanterns into the dark sky. Earthly paper lanterns and Irhi lanterns made of glowing moss. The lights rose in a jumble, intertwining, and from the height of the ridge, it was already impossible to tell which light belonged to which world. And in that indistinguishability lay the whole point. The door in the arch behind them glowed with an even blue thread of light. Open on both sides, in no hurry to go anywhere. Just a door between 2 homes. Dan watched the rising lights and knew that the story of the 4 stranded on a poisonous planet had ended. Because the planet was no longer poisonous. It was healing with every dawn, and because they were no longer stranded. People get stuck where there's no way out, but now they had more ways out than there were doors. They were home, on both sides of the door. And when the last flashlight faded between the 2 moons, Dan was the first to stand up and offer his hand to the girls, and all 4 of them walked down to the square, to the fires, to the people, and to Erie, to their shared life. In the spring, the caravan set out for the 3rd mountain. But this was no longer a story of rescue. It was simply work. Good work, in its rightful place, in its own world, in both of their worlds. The spring caravan of the 2 peoples, having suffered losses, passed through the Deadlands, and Dan and Arhi awakened the 2nd mountain, where the exiles began to rebuild the land of their ancestors, and the chieftain called this the true end of the exile. At the first arch, a settlement of bridges sprang up, with Emma's school, the pasta patent secured by Laura for the Erie people, a hospital funded by corporate payments, Mia's infirmary, and the lives of families from both worlds. On the open house day, 400 days after the relocation, the heroes took stock. The planet was healing, the peoples had reconciled, and the door had become an ordinary road.